drive from Wheeling to Lost Creek took 90 minutes on a good day, longer when the autumn rains turned the hollow roads to soup. I made it every few weeks, same as I had since Dad died and left me the F-150, along with the unspoken obligation to check on Mama. The truck's odometer had rolled past 180,000 miles, most of them on this same route, Route 19 south to Weston. Then the winding county roads that got narrower and more forgotten with each turn until the asphalt gave way to gravel and the cell signal dropped to nothing. I worked construction in Wheeling, framing houses for developments that all looked the same. Cookie-cutter colonials for people moving out from Pittsburgh. The work was steady, the pay decent enough to keep me in a one-bedroom apartment near the river and my truck running. I'd been with Morrison & Sons for 8 years, ever since I came back from 2 years of trying college in Morgantown and realizing I had no stomach for sitting in classrooms when I could be outside with my hands doing something real. My crew knew Widdicombe not to expect me Friday afternoons from October through March. I'd leave the job site at 3, stop at the Giant Eagle for Mama's groceries. She had a list that never changed, wrote it in the same careful cursive on the back of old envelopes, and hit the road before the weekend traffic got thick. The routine was comfortable, predictable. I knew every curve of those roads, every place where the hills pressed close and the hollows opened up like cupped hands, like holding onto the last remnants of communities that used to be something. Lost Creek wasn't even a town anymore, just a scatter of houses along a valley that ran 4 miles between ridges so steep and wooded they seemed to lean inward. 8 families now, down from 30 when Dad was young. The Hendersons still ran a few head of cattle. The Pratts had chickens and a vegetable garden that supplied half the hollow. Old Mr. Chen, nobody remembered his first name, lived alone in a house that was slowly sinking into its foundation. And Mama had the place Great-Granddad built in 1923, 2-story clapboard with a tin roof and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, set back from the road with an acre of yard and the forest pressing close behind. That October Friday, the sky had that bruised look that meant rain before morning, heavy clouds sitting on the ridge lines like they were too tired to move on. I pulled into Mama's drive around 5:30, the truck's tires crunching on gravel, and killed the engine. The silence hit me first, before I'd even opened the door. Not the usual silence of the hollow. There was always something, squirrels chittering in the oaks, crows calling from the ridge, the distant sound of the Hendersons' cattle. This was different. A silence that pressed against my ears like I'd gone deep underwater. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, and tried to remember if I'd ever heard the hollow this quiet. I remember thinking, maybe it was the weather, the pressure change, before a storm that made animals hunker down and wait it out. But the air didn't feel like storm air. It felt like something else. Something that made my skin prickle in a way I couldn't name. Mama came out on the porch before I'd grabbed the groceries, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 78, built like a cedar fence post, all wire and weathered strength. Her hair was white and pulled back in the same bun she'd worn since my childhood, and her face had the kind of lines that came from squinting into sun and wind for 8 decades. "You're late," she said, but her voice didn't have its usual edge of teasing. She glanced past me toward the tree line, her eyes narrowing. "Hit traffic in Weston," I said, hauling the grocery bags out of the truck bed. "They're doing road work on 19. "You bring the flour? The 5-pound bag? Not that little thing?" Yes, ma'am. And the coffee you like, the one in the red can. She nodded but didn't smile, still looking past me toward the woods. I followed her gaze and saw nothing but the usual wall of trees, oak and maple, losing their leaves in slow drifts, the underbrush thick with autumn's decay. But something about her posture made me stop and look harder, searching for whatever had caught her attention. "What is it?" I asked. She shook her head and turned back to the door. "Nothing. Come on inside before you let all the heat out." I followed her in, but that nothing sat heavy in my gut. Mama didn't spook easy. She'd lived in this hollow through everything. The flood of '78 that took out half the bridges in the county. The winter of '94 when the hollow was snowed in for 3 weeks. The time a black bear came through and tore up her garbage. She'd faced down door-to-door preachers and census takers and developers wanting to buy her land. Never flinched once. Seeing her look at those woods with that expression in her eyes made something cold settle at the base of my spine. Inside, the house smelled like it always did. Wood smoke and coffee and the lavender sachets Mama hung in every closet. The living room hadn't changed since my childhood. Same worn couch, same wood stove that heated the whole downstairs, same pictures on the mantle of family going back 4 generations. My dad looked out from a frame next to the stove, 20 years younger than when the black lung took him, still healthy and grinning with a 12-point buck he'd taken up on the ridge. I set the groceries on the kitchen counter and started unpacking while Mama put water on for coffee. She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd performed the same tasks for 60 years in the same space. But I noticed her glance toward the window more than once, her hands pausing mid-motion before continuing. "How are the chickens doing?" I asked, making conversation, trying to ease whatever tension I felt building in the room. "Haven't come out of the coop in 3 days," she said, measuring coffee grounds into the percolator. "Not even for feed. I have to take it into them." "They sick?" "Don't think so. Their eating just won't come outside, and Duke won't go past the porch anymore." That stopped me mid-reach for a can of soup. Duke was Mama's hound, a blue tick she'd had for 9 years, and that dog lived for running through the woods. He'd chase anything that moved. Squirrels, rabbits, once a fox that led him on a 3-hour chase up the ridge. The idea of Duke refusing to leave the porch didn't make sense. "When did that start?" I asked. "Week ago, maybe. He goes to the edge of the porch, sniffs the air, then backs up whining. Won't even come down the steps." I walked to the living room and looked out the front window. Duke was there, lying on the porch boards near the door, but he wasn't relaxed the way he usually was. His head was up, hygiene ears forward, and he was staring toward the tree line with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up as I watched. A shudder ran through him, and his lips pulled back from his teeth in a silent snarl. "Something's got them spooked," Mama said from behind me. "The Hendersons' cattle are all bunched up at the far end of their pasture. Won't come near the fence line by the woods. And Pratt's lost 8 chickens, night before last." I turned to look at her. "Fox?" "That's what Ben Pratt said. But the thing tore through his chicken wire like it was cobwebs, and it didn't eat them, just killed them and left them scattered all over the yard." "What kind of fox does that?" I didn't have an answer. A fox killed to eat, maybe killed more than it needed and cached the extra, but it didn't just kill for killing's sake. That was human behavior or something worse. I remember thinking maybe it was a dog gone feral, some pit bull someone had dumped that was getting territorial, But even that didn't explain the wire torn to pieces or the way Duke was acting. The silence outside pressed against the windows, thick and wrong. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. Nothing but the whisper of wind through empty branches. Probably a bear, I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. Maybe pushed down from higher up by hunters or hunger. They do that sometimes this time of year, looking for easy food before denning up. Mama poured coffee into 2 mugs, handed me one, and looked me straight in the eye. You hear any bears that rip through wire fence and don't eat what they kill? I didn't answer. We stood there drinking coffee while the afternoon light dimmed and the silence outside got heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching the house from the tree line, something patient and hungry, waiting for darkness to fall. That night, after helping Mama with the dinner dishes and chopping kindling for her wood stove, I took the trash out to the burn barrel behind the house. The motion sensor light over the back door clicked on, throwing a cone of white light across the yard. But beyond that was darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light rather than just exist beside it. I'd brought a flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that doubled as a club, and I clicked it on as I stepped off the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, showing me the worn path to the burn barrel, the woodpile covered with a tarp, the edge of the yard where grass gave way to weeds and then forest. I dumped the trash, metal clattering in the barrel, and turned to head back. That's when I saw them. 2 points of amber light, reflecting my flashlight beam from the tree line. They were too high off the ground. 7 feet at least, maybe more. Too high for a dog or coyote. Too high for any deer I'd ever seen. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just held steady in the darkness like headlights on a car that wasn't running, catching the light and throwing it back at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. I stood there frozen, trash bags still in my hand, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Some trick of the light, maybe. A reflection off metal or glass in the woods, some piece of trash someone had dumped. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Those were eyes, and they were watching me with a focus that felt almost intelligent, almost aware. My instinct was to yell, make noise, do something to scare off whatever it was. But my throat had closed up, and all I could do was stare back while my heart hammered against my ribs. The eyes didn't waver, didn't shift, just held position like whatever owned them had all the time in the world, and was perfectly content to watch me standing there in the flashlight beam like a rabbit caught in the open. Then they were gone. Then no movement, no sound of something retreating through the brush, just there one moment and gone the next, like someone had flipped a switch. I backed toward the house, flashlight beam sweeping the tree line, my hand shaking enough that the light jerked and jumped across the trees. The motion sensor light clicked off, and I nearly dropped the flashlight, scrambling to get back into its range, get that white light flooding the yard again. When it came on, I could see the whole tree line clearly, every trunk and branch and shadow, and there was nothing there but forest. Inside, Mama looked up from her crossword puzzle. You see it? The question hit me like cold water. See what? Whatever's out there in the woods. I wanted to lie, wanted to tell her I'd just gotten spooked by my own shadow, but something in her eyes stopped me. She knew she'd seen something too. Something that made her chickens hide and her dog whine and her grandson freeze in the backyard with trash in his hand. Eyes, I said, too high up. Amber-colored. She nodded slowly and went back to her crossword puzzle like I'd just confirmed the weather forecast. Started seeing them 4 nights ago. They watch the house after dark. Haven't come closer than the tree line yet, but they're watching. I barely slept that night, lying in the narrow bed in the upstairs room I'd used since childhood, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind against the windows, made my pulse jump. The darkness outside felt different than it used to, not empty, but occupied, like something was moving through it with purpose and patience. By dawn, I'd convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, or maybe an owl perched on a high branch. People saw what they expected to see, and I'd been primed by Mama's talk of strange behavior, by Duke's whining, by the unnatural silence. The mind could conjure monsters out of shadows when it was looking for them. I found Mama in the kitchen, already dressed and working on biscuits, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of cutting butter into flour. She glanced at me but didn't speak, and I knew better than to bring up what I'd seen. In the hollow, some things got discussed and some didn't, and the line between them was drawn by generations of people who'd learned that talking about certain subjects only gave them more power. After breakfast, I drove to Henderson's place, a half-mile down the road. Their cattle were still clustered at the far fence, a tight knot of brown and white bodies pressed together like they were trying to merge into one organism. Ben Henderson was in his barn, mucking stalls, and he straightened when he saw me coming. "Sebastian," he said, leaning on his pitchfork, "your grandma doing all right?" "Yes, sir, came to ask you about your cattle. They been acting strange?" His face tightened, and he glanced toward the pasture where his herd was still bunched up, refusing to graze in the good grass closer to the woods. "Week or so now. Won't go near that fence line. Lost a calf 3 nights back." The information hit me like a fist to the gut. "Lost how?" "Found it in the pasture, throat torn out. Whatever got it came right through the fence, took the calf down, and left it. Didn't eat hardly nothing off it, just killed it and moved on." "You report it?" Henderson shook his head. "Called Bill Morris, the game warden. He came out, looked at the tracks, said it was probably a bear. But I've seen bear kills. Sebastian, they eat what they take down. They don't just murder for sport." "What did the tracks look like?" "That's the thing." Henderson set down his pitchfork and pulled off his work gloves, studying his calloused hands like they held answers. "They were dog tracks, kind of big, maybe 6 inches across with claw marks. But the stride was wrong, the pattern. Bill said maybe a wolf, but there haven't been wolves in West Virginia in 80 years. And these tracks, some of them looked like..." He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind. You'll think I'm crazy. Try me. Some of them looked almost human, like someone walking on the balls of their feet, but with claws. Bill said I was seeing things, that the tracks got distorted by the mud. Maybe he's right." I stood there in Henderson's barn while the smell of hay and manure filled my nose, and I felt the cold certainty settling into my bones that whatever I'd seen watching the house wasn't a bear or a wolf or anything that had a name in the natural world. But I couldn't say that out loud. Couldn't voice the thought without sounding like I'd lost my mind. "You got those tracks still? Mind if I take a look?" Henderson led me out to the pasture. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see where something had torn through the fence. Not dug under or squeezed through, but torn the wire like it was paper. The fence posts were still standing, but the wire between them hung in twisted shreds. The tracks were there in the mud beyond the fence, exactly like Henderson had described. Dog-like, but wrong. Too long in the digits. The claw marks set deep and far forward. I followed them for 20 yards into the pasture, and Henderson was right. The stride pattern didn't make sense. Sometimes the tracks showed 4 clear paw prints in a pattern that suggested a 4-legged animal moving at a trot. But then they'd shift, becoming 2 deeper impressions with longer spaces between them, like something had stood up and walked on its hind legs for several yards before dropping back down. I crouched next to one of the 2-footed tracks and put my hand beside it for scale. The print was easily twice the width of my palm, and the heel impression was elongated, almost human in shape, but with that characteristic arch that came from walking on the balls of the feet. The toes spread wide with thick claw marks, extending an inch beyond each digit. "What do you think?" Henderson asked from behind me. I didn't answer right away. My mind cycled through every nature documentary I'd ever watched, every hunting trip I'd been on with my father, every animal I'd tracked or studied. Nothing fit. This was either something I'd never encountered before, or someone was playing an elaborate hoax, and neither option made sense. "I don't know," I said finally, standing up and brushing mud from my hands. "But it's not a bear." Back at Mama's, I spent the afternoon on her computer, an old Dell I'd bought her 5 years ago that she used mostly for email and online church services. I searched for reports of strange animals in West Virginia, unusual predator attacks, anything that might explain what I'd seen. The internet offered plenty of theories. Black panthers that weren't supposed to exist east of the Mississippi, coyotes with mange that looked almost human, even Bigfoot sightings that people swore were real. But nothing matched what I'd seen in those amber eyes. Nothing explained the tracks that shifted from 4 legs to 2. I called my cousin Ray around 4, catching him at his mechanic shop in Clarksburg. Ray was 5 years older than me, built like a linebacker, with a mind that worked in straight lines and practical solutions. If anyone would give me a reality check, it was him. "Sebastian," he answered on the 3rd ring, and I could hear the pneumatic hiss of an air wrench in the background. "What's up? You ever hear stories about wolves in the hollow? Big ones, maybe 7 feet tall on their hind legs?" The air wrench stopped. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Something's been killing livestock around here. Henderson's lost a calf, Pratt's lost chickens, and the tracks don't match anything I've seen before. So call the game warden. That's what he gets paid for." "He thinks it's a bear." "Then it's probably a bear." "You getting spooked by Mama's stories again? Remember when you were 10 and she convinced you the Jersey Devil lived in the root cellar?" I felt heat rise in my face. That was different. I was a kid. "And now you're 32, seeing monsters in the woods?" "Come on, Sebastian. It's probably just a big dog someone dumped, or a bear like the warden said. Don't let the hollow get to you. That place has always been creepy as hell, especially this time of year." "Yeah," I said, "you're probably right." But after I hung up, I sat there staring at Mama's computer screen, at the blurry photographs people posted of mysterious shapes in forests, and I knew Ray was wrong. I'd seen those eyes. I'd seen the intelligence in them, the focused attention that no animal possessed. Whatever was watching the house wasn't a bear or a dog or anything that could be explained away with rational thinking. Mama came in around 6 with a grocery bag full of supplies from her shed. Salt, iron nails, dried herbs I didn't recognize. She spread them on the kitchen table and started sorting through them like she was preparing for surgery. "What's all this for?" I asked. "Protection," she said simply. "Same as my grandmother used and her mother before that." "Mama, this is the 21st century. We've got phones and internet and none of that matters when something old comes calling." She looked at me with those sharp eyes that had seen 8 decades of life in these hills. "You think your great-great-grandmother built this house where she did by accident? You think she hung horseshoes over every door and window for decoration? There's things in these woods that were here before any of us, Sebastian, and they'll be here after we're gone. The only question is whether you're fool enough to ignore them." I wanted to argue, wanted to pull out my phone and show her articles about rational explanations for animal behavior, about how superstition and fear could make people see things that weren't there. But I'd seen those eyes. I'd seen Henderson's calf with its throat torn out. I'd seen the tracks that shifted from 4 legs to 2. So instead of arguing, I helped her line the windowsills with salt and hang iron nails above every door. That night, I volunteered to take the trash out again. I told myself it was to prove I wasn't scared, that whatever I'd seen the night before had been nothing more than an owl or a reflection. But the truth was darker. I needed to know if those eyes would be there again, needed confirmation that I hadn't imagined them. The motion sensor light clicked on as I stepped onto the back porch, and I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Duke was pressed against the door behind me, whining low in his throat. But he wouldn't follow me out. The darkness beyond the light seemed thicker than usual, more substantial, like it had weight and texture. I walked to the burn barrel with the mag light in one hand and the trash bag in the other, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The beam swept across the yard, touching the woodpile. The old hand pump that hadn't worked in years. The rusted frame of a truck my grandfather had been meaning to restore. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should. Then I turned the flashlight toward the tree line, and the beam caught them immediately. Those same amber eyes, reflecting the light back at me like polished glass. They were in the exact same spot as the night before, 7 feet up, unblinking and steady, but this time I forced myself to keep the light on them, to study them instead of running. The eyes were too large, each one maybe the size of a silver dollar, set wide apart in what must have been a substantial skull. The amber color was shot through with gold and red, like flames frozen in glass. They didn't shift or look away, just held my gaze with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I could see now that they weren't reflecting the light the way a deer's eyes would, with that flat shine that came from the tapetum lucidum. These eyes seemed to gather the light and hold it, radiating their own luminescence. One thought cut through with absolute clarity. I should be running. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drop the trash and get back to the house, to put walls and locked doors between me and whatever owned those eyes. But I was frozen, pinned in place by equal parts terror and fascination, unable to look away from something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. The eyes moved. Not much, just a slight shift to the left, maybe 3 feet, and I realized whatever I was looking at had taken a step. It had moved deliberately, consciously, letting me know it could move while still holding position in the tree line. A deer would have bolted at the light. A bear would have turned away. This thing was testing me, measuring me, letting me understand that it was choosing to stay at the tree line, and that choice could change at any moment. My hand started shaking, the flashlight beam jerking across the trees, and the eyes tracked the movement with perfect precision. I saw them narrow slightly, and even from 80 feet away I could feel the weight of that gaze, the calculation happening behind those amber lights. This wasn't an animal operating on instinct. This was something thinking, planning, deciding what to do about the human standing in the yard with a flashlight. I backed toward the house, one step at a time, keeping the beam on those eyes. They didn't follow me, didn't move again, just watched as I retreated. The motion sensor light clicked off, and I nearly tripped, scrambling back into its range. When it came on again, flooding the yard with white light, I could still see those eyes glowing in the darkness beyond the light's reach, and I understood with terrible clarity that the light wasn't protection. It just let me see what was watching me. Inside, I locked the door and stood with my back against it, breathing hard, my hands still shaking. Duke pressed against my legs, whining, and Mama appeared in the kitchen doorway with a shotgun I didn't know she owned. "You saw it again," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Did it come closer?" "Moved a little, 3 feet maybe, but it stayed in the trees." She nodded and set the shotgun against the wall within easy reach. "It's testing us, seeing how we react, what we're made of." My grandmother said they do that sometimes, the old things. They watch and wait until they know your patterns, know when you're weakest. "What is it, Mama? What are we dealing with here?" She looked at me with eyes that held 8 decades of hollow wisdom, of stories passed down through generations of people who'd learned to live alongside things that didn't belong in biology textbooks. "Does it matter what we call it? You've seen it. You know it's real. Whether we call it a wolf or a devil or something else entirely, it's still out there in those woods, and it's still watching this house." I wanted to protest, wanted to insist that names mattered, that identifying something was the first step to understanding and dealing with it. But she was right. I'd spent all day trying to rationalize and categorize what I'd seen, and it hadn't changed the fundamental truth. Something was in those woods, something that didn't fit any definition I knew, and it was watching us with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. 3 nights later, I saw its shape. I'd been checking the game cameras I'd set up along the tree line, cheap trail cameras from Walmart that I'd mounted on stakes facing the woods. Every morning I'd retrieve the SD cards and review the footage, looking for evidence of what I'd seen. But every time, the footage showed nothing but static-filled darkness or strange blur patterns, like something was interfering with the electronics. I told myself the cameras were junk, that I'd gotten what I paid for, even as a deeper part of me understood that whatever was watching the house didn't want to be recorded. That evening I'd stayed later than usual, helping Mama with some repairs to her porch railing that had rotted through in spots. The sun was setting behind the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. When I finally loaded my tools into the truck bed and prepared to head back to Wheeling, I had work Monday morning, a foundation pour that couldn't be delayed, and I'd already pushed my weekend visit as long as I could. Mama came out to say goodbye, wrapping a container of leftover soup for me to take home. "You drive careful," she said, "and don't come back next weekend. Wait a few weeks, let things settle down. I'm not leaving you here alone with that thing in the woods. I've been managing on my own since your granddad passed, Sebastian. I'll manage a few more weeks. But I could see the fear behind her eyes, the way she glanced toward the tree line. Even in the fading daylight, Duke was on the porch again, lying with his head between his paws, and he didn't even raise his head when I walked past. The dog had barely moved in days, refusing food, just lying there and staring at the woods with his ears flat against his skull. I was climbing into the truck when I saw it, a shape against the darkening sky, standing between two oak trees at the forest edge. The setting sun provided just enough backlight to show me its silhouette, and my hand froze on the truck door. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. The body was wrong, too broad through the shoulders and chest, tapering to narrow hips that suggested power and speed rather than the bulk of a bear. The head was elongated, wolf-like, with pointed ears that swiveled independently, and I could see the suggestion of a snout even in silhouette. But it was standing upright, balanced on legs that bent backward at the knee like a dog's, digitigrade, with the weight on the balls of its feet. The arms were too long, hanging past where its hips would be, and I could see the definition of muscle even in shadow, the thick cording of a predator built for killing. It shifted its weight, a slight movement from one leg to the other, and the proportions became even more apparent. This wasn't something that walked on all fours most of the time and occasionally reared up. This was built for upright locomotion, for walking and running on two legs while keeping those long arms free for other purposes. I stood there with my hand on the truck door, unable to move, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind kept trying to categorize it, to fit it into some framework I understood. A bear, that's what it had to be, just a bear standing up to get a better view. But bears didn't have that posture, that balance, that shape. Bears were rounded and hunched, even when standing. This thing was poised, alert, every line of its body suggesting coiled violence. The head turned, and I knew it was looking directly at me, even though I couldn't see its eyes in the shadow. It held position for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, letting me see it, letting me understand what I was dealing with. Then it dropped to all fours with a movement so fluid it seemed boneless. And in that position it looked even more wrong. Too large, too powerful. The front legs shorter than the back, in a way that suggested something meant to walk upright but willing to use 4 legs when speed was needed. It moved along the tree line, parallel to Mama's property line, and I tracked it with my eyes as it passed between trees, appearing and disappearing in the shadows. The movement was predatory, purposeful, like it was pacing the boundary of a territory it claimed. After maybe 30 yards, it stopped and rose back to 2 legs, turning to face the house again, and this time I could see its profile against the sky, the massive head, the powerful neck, the slope of its shoulders. "Sebastian," Mama called from the porch, her voice tight. "Get in the house. Now." But I couldn't move. I was pinned in place by the sight of something that couldn't exist but clearly did, by the certainty that I was looking at a predator that saw me as potential prey, by the understanding that everything I thought I knew about the natural world was wrong. The thing, and I couldn't think of it as an animal anymore, it was just thing, creature, entity, took a step forward, coming out from the tree line into the open yard. Just one step, but it closed maybe 6 feet of distance with that single movement, and I could see the power in its legs, the way the muscles bunched and released. It stopped at the edge of Mama's property, right where the mowed grass gave way to wild growth, and I had the distinct impression it was testing a boundary, seeing if it could cross some invisible line. "Sebastian," Mama's voice was sharper now, commanding. "Iron, get the iron!" The words broke through my paralysis. I reached into the truck bed where I'd left my toolbox and grabbed the first thing my hand touched, a 2-foot length of iron rebar I'd been using for the porch repair. The moment my fingers closed around the metal, the thing at the property line took a step backward, retreating into the shadow of the trees. It didn't flee, didn't bolt, just withdrew with the same deliberate precision it had shown in everything else. I backed toward the house, keeping my eyes on the tree line. The rebar clutched in my hand like a talisman. Mama held the door open, and the moment I was through, she slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt, then dragged a kitchen chair over and wedged it under the knob. "You saw it clear," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "What do you think it is?" I leaned against the door, my heart hammering, my hands shaking so hard I had to set down the rebar before I dropped it. Outside, the darkness was complete now, the last light fading from the sky, and I knew that thing was still out there, watching the house, waiting for something I couldn't predict. "I don't know," I said, and the admission felt like defeat. "But it's not any animal I've ever seen. It's not natural, Mama. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't belong in any wildlife guide." She nodded slowly, like I'd finally caught up to something she'd known all along. "My grandmother had a name for things like that. She called them the Old Hungry. Said they lived in the deepest parts of the forest, in places where the trees grew so thick no light touched the ground. Said they were older than the hollow, older than the towns, maybe older than the people themselves." "That's just stories," I said, but the words had no conviction behind them. I'd seen it. I'd seen the shape of something that shouldn't exist. Seen it move with intelligence and purpose. Seen it test the boundaries of Mama's property, like it was looking for weaknesses. "Stories keep people alive," Mama said. "Stories teach us what to fear and how to protect ourselves. You think your ancestors hung iron over their doors for decoration? You think they lined their windowsills with salt because they liked the way it looked?" I didn't have an answer to that. I stood there in Mama's kitchen while the darkness pressed against the windows, and I tried to convince myself that I'd seen wrong, that the fading light and my own fear had distorted something ordinary into something monstrous. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. That night, neither of us slept. We sat at the kitchen table while Duke huddled between Mama's feet, his whole body trembling like he'd been left out in winter. Every few minutes I'd get up and check the windows, peer through the curtains at the darkness outside, see nothing but the black shapes of trees against the marginally lighter sky. Around 3 a.m, Duke's trembling turned to low, continuous growling. Not the warning sound he made at strangers or other dogs, but something I'd never heard from him before. A sound that came from deep in his chest and never quite stopped, just kept vibrating through him like an engine that couldn't shut down. "He knows it's still out there," Mama said. She was holding her rosary, the wooden beads clicking through her fingers in a rhythm I remembered from childhood, from every crisis and worry that had touched our family. Animals know these things better than we do. They can smell wrongness. I wanted to tell her she was being superstitious, that Duke was just old and confused and scared by my own fear. But I couldn't get the words out, because every instinct I had was screaming the same thing Duke's growl was saying. Danger, predator, run. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, I walked the perimeter of the property with the rebar in one hand and my phone in the other, taking pictures of everything. I found tracks at the property line, right where I'd seen the thing standing. They were pressed deep into the soft earth, and I crouched down to examine them, my hands shaking as I held the phone close. The prints were wrong in every possible way. 5 toes like a canid, but the arrangement was off. The outside toe sat too far back, almost like a dew claw, but much larger. The pad was massive, easily 6 inches across, and the claw marks extended another 3 inches beyond that, dug into the earth like the thing had been standing there for some time, shifting its weight, watching the house. But it was the stride length that made my stomach drop. I found another print about 8 feet away, then another beyond that. Whatever this thing was, it could cover ground faster than anything I'd ever tracked. And the depth of the impressions suggested it weighed several 100 pounds at minimum. I took maybe 30 photos, different angles, with my hand in frame for scale, with the measuring tape from my toolbox laid alongside. Evidence, proof, something to show people that I wasn't losing my mind. Then I noticed something else. Between the tracks, pressed into the grass, were marks that looked almost like knuckle prints, places where something had dropped to all fours and used its front limbs for support. The spacing was all wrong for a bear. Bears lumber their front and back prints, cluster close together. These marks suggested something that could switch between bipedal and quadrupedal movement, something that could choose how it moved based on speed or stealth or purpose. I spent 3 hours that morning documenting everything, walking the entire tree line, finding more tracks, more signs. In one spot, maybe 20 yards into the woods, I found where it had been bedded down, a depression in the leaves with several saplings bent and broken around it, creating a kind of hide where it could watch the house without being seen. The vegetation was crushed flat in a rough oval about 7 feet long, and when I touched the ground there, the leaves were still damp, still held the shape of something massive that had been lying there recently. Around the hide, I found marks on the tree trunks, deep vertical gouges in the bark, clusters of 4 parallel cuts that started about 5 feet up and dragged downward. Claw marks. I put my hand up to them, tried to match my fingers to the spacing, and found I couldn't. Whatever had made these marks had fingers or claws spaced wider than human hands, and the depth of the cuts suggested incredible force. One of the gouges had penetrated nearly an inch into the hardwood of an oak tree. I photographed everything, but even as I did, some part of me knew it wouldn't matter. I'd seen enough cryptid and paranormal shows to know how this worked. Grainy photos that could be anything. Tracks that experts would dismiss as hoaxed or misidentified. Evidence that somehow always fell short of definitive proof. By the time I got back to the house, Mama had breakfast ready. Eggs and bacon and biscuits. The morning ritual she'd maintained for as long as I could remember. She poured coffee like it was any other Sunday, and we sat at the table in silence, both of us exhausted but too wired to sleep. "You should go back to Wheeling," she said finally. "Get some distance from this. I'm not leaving you here alone with that thing out there. I've lived in this hollow all my life, Sebastian. Whatever that creature is, it's been in these woods longer than me, and I'm still here. It's you it's interested in now. You saw it clear, you met its eyes, and that means something to it. That means you're marked." The word made my skin crawl. Marked? My grandmother told me about this, said the old hungry would pick someone, single them out, and once they did, there was no ignoring it, no pretending it away. It would keep coming until something got resolved. Either it got what it wanted, or you drove it off permanent, or she trailed off. But I knew how that sentence ended. Or it kills you. I spent the rest of Sunday checking and rechecking the locks, boarding up the broken window in the back bedroom that I'd found when I came back from the woods. The glass shattered inward, the frame splintered, curtains torn. Mama claimed she hadn't heard anything during the night, but I'd been sitting in the kitchen and I hadn't heard it either, which meant the thing could move with absolute silence when it chose to. The window had been forced open from outside, the latch torn straight out of the wood. I found the bent metal pieces in the grass below, twisted like they'd been gripped in a vise. Something had looked into that room, maybe tried to climb through but found the opening too small, then withdrew. I nailed boards across the window frame, 2x4s screwed directly into the studs with 3-inch deck screws. It wouldn't stop something with that kind of strength, but at least it would slow it down, make noise, give warning. Ray called around noon, asking if I wanted to come over for the Steelers game and some beers. I made excuses, said I needed to help Mama with more repairs, and his voice got that careful, concerned tone that meant he thought I was avoiding him. Maybe I was. How could I sit in his living room and watch football when something from a nightmare was stalking my grandmother's property? That evening, as the sun started its decline toward the western ridgeline, I set up what I thought of as my defensive position. I moved one of the kitchen chairs to the living room window that faced the woods, positioned myself with clear sight lines to the tree line, and laid out everything I could think of as potential weapons. The rebar, a kitchen knife, the old baseball bat from the hall closet, my father's .30-06 that Mama kept in the bedroom, loaded now, 5 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. I'd never shot at anything larger than paper targets and the occasional groundhog or raiding Mama's garden. The idea of pointing that rifle at something that looked even remotely human made my hands sweat. But I'd seen the tracks, seen the size of those claw marks, and I knew that if it came to it, I wouldn't hesitate. Mama sat in her recliner, rosary still in her hands, and we watched the darkness come on like a tide. Duke had stopped growling, which somehow felt worse. He'd wedged himself under the couch and wouldn't come out, even when Mama tried to coax him with bacon. I could see his eyes in the shadows under there, wide and white-rimmed, tracking every sound. Full dark came at 6:45. I marked the time on my phone, watched the last gray light bleed out of the sky, watched the tree line turn from detail to silhouette to simple absence of stars. Nothing happened for the first hour. Wind moved through the hollow, rattling the dry leaves that still clung to the oaks. Somewhere far off, I heard the Hendersons' cattle lowing, that distressed sound they'd been making for days now. The normal sounds of a West Virginia evening. Then, at 7:53, the motion sensor light by the woodpile clicked on. It lit up maybe 40 feet of yard, the LED bulbs harsh and white, and I saw it immediately, crouched beside the woodpile like it had been there all along, just waiting for the light to find it. I'd thought I was prepared. I'd thought seeing it from a distance had inoculated me somehow, that the next encounter would be less shocking because I knew what to expect. I was wrong. The thing was going through Mama's split oak, the logs she'd stacked for winter burning, and it was using its hands. Not paws, not even the hybrid appendages you'd see on a raccoon or a bear. Hands. They had the same basic structure as human hands. Thumb opposed to four fingers, but stretched and wrong, the fingers too long, the joints bending at slight angles that didn't match human anatomy. The palms were broad and padded, furred in the same gray-black that covered the rest of it, but the skin of the palms looked leathery and dark, like old boot leather, and the claws. Each finger ended in a curved black claw, maybe 3 inches long, thick at the base, and tapering to points that looked sharp as razors. As I watched, the thing gripped one of the oak logs, easily 20 pounds of seasoned hardwood, and those claws dug into the grain like it was butter. The creature lifted the log to its face, and I saw its snout clearly for the first time. It was elongated, definitely canine in basic structure, but too heavy in the jaw, too many teeth visible even with the mouth closed. The fur on the muzzle was shorter than on the rest of the body, and I could see the muscle structure underneath, the way the jaw hinged wider than any wolf's should. The nose was black and wet, nostrils flaring as it scented the wood, and then, this was the detail that nearly made me drop the rifle. It sneezed. The sound was sharp and sudden, and somehow domestic. The kind of noise Duke made when dust got in his nose, and the absolute wrongness of hearing that normal sound come from something so monstrous nearly broke my brain. The creature shook its head, a very dog-like gesture, and then it did something I would have sworn was impossible. It spoke. Not words, not language, but it made a sound that wasn't animal. A low vocalization that had cadence and intention behind it, almost questioning, like it was talking to itself. The sound lasted maybe 3 seconds, a series of huffs and rumbles that were too complex to be simple animal noise, too structured to be random. Then it went back to examining the wood, turning the log over in its hands with the same curiosity a human might show, looking at it from different angles. Those hands moved with precision and purpose, and I could see now that they had opposable thumbs that functioned exactly like human thumbs, gripping and releasing, capable of fine manipulation. The hands were the worst part. If it had been pure animal, all fang and claw and instinct, I could have processed it as some unknown species, some evolutionary divergence. But those hands suggested intelligence, tool use, understanding. Those hands suggested something that could think. It set down the log and picked up another heavier piece, and then without warning it whipped its head around and looked directly at the house, directly at the window where I sat frozen with the rifle. The motion sensor light caught its eyes full on, and they flared amber bright, reflective like a cat's eyes but larger. The pupils vertical slits that contracted in the sudden light. The face was broader than a wolf's, more bear-like in proportions, but shaped all wrong. The cheekbones too pronounced, the brow ridge too heavy. The ears were set high on the skull, triangular and mobile, swiveling independently to track sounds I couldn't hear. It watched the house, watched the window, and I knew, with the certainty of prey-facing predator, that it could see me clearly through the glass, could see me sitting there with the rifle, could see Mama in her recliner and Duke hiding under the couch. It knew we were aware of it, and it didn't care. The creature set down the log, very carefully, very deliberately, and then it stood up. It had been crouching, and I'd estimated it at maybe 6 feet tall. Standing, it was closer to 7.5, maybe 8. The torso was almost human in proportion, but massively built, shoulders broader than any man's, chest deep and powerful. The legs were wrong, though, digitigrade like a dog's, with an extra joint that gave it a spring-loaded quality, and the feet, I could see them clearly now, were elongated, built for both power and speed. It wore no clothing, had no collar or tags, or any sign of human contact, but the musculature suggested something that used its body with trained precision. This wasn't a shambling movie monster. This was an apex predator that moved with the efficiency of something that had been hunting for a very long time. For maybe 30 seconds, we stared at each other through the glass. The creature didn't move, didn't threaten, just stood there at the woodpile with its hands hanging loose at its sides, watching, studying, learning. Then it dropped to all fours in a single fluid motion, those two long arms bending at angles that looked painful but obviously weren't. And it moved, not toward the house, but along the tree line, circling. It covered maybe 40 feet in 3 seconds, moving with a loping gait that was hypnotic in its power, and then it was beyond the reach of the motion sensor light, swallowed by darkness. I jumped up and ran to the side window, the one that faced north, trying to track it. But the yard was dark there, and I couldn't see anything. I ran to the kitchen window, then the back bedroom window, but it had vanished like it had never been there at all. "Stay away from the windows," Mama said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "It's circling, trying to find weaknesses." I came back to the living room, breathing hard, the rifle clutched tight enough that my knuckles were white. It looked right at me. It knew I was here. "Of course it did. I told you, you're marked now. It's not interested in an old woman and a crippled dog. It wants you, Sebastian. You're the one that needs to leave." "I'm not..." The motion sensor clicked on again, and this time the creature was at the back porch, maybe 15 feet from the kitchen door. It was standing upright again, and I could see its full body now in the harsh light. The fur was thick, but not uniform. Longer on the shoulders and spine, shorter on the chest and belly. The coloring was dark gray with black points, and I could see old scars through the fur, pale lines across the ribs and forearms that spoke of fights survived, of a life lived in violence. But it was the expression that stopped my heart. The creature was looking at the door, and its face held something like curiosity, like interest. The ears were forward, the head tilted slightly, and as I watched, it reached out with one clawed hand and touched the doorknob. The door was locked, deadbolt thrown, but the creature's fingers wrapped around the knob and twisted. The metal groaned. The door frame creaked. For a moment, I thought the lock was going to hold, that the door would stay closed. And then the entire knob assembly tore out of the door with a sound like breaking bone. The creature held the twisted metal in its hand, turning it over like it was something curious, something interesting. Then it looked up at the door again, at the new hole where the lock had been, and it pushed. The door swung open 6 inches, stopped by the security chain I'd installed 3 years ago. The creature pushed harder, and the chain went taut, and I could see the screws starting to pull out of the door frame. I was moving before I'd made a conscious decision, running to the kitchen with the rifle, screaming something. I don't remember what. And the creature's head snapped around to look at me through the gap. We were maybe 10 feet apart. I could smell it now. A thick musk like wet dog, but darker, heavier, with an undertone of copper and something else I couldn't identify. Its breath steamed in the cold air, and I could see the teeth clearly now. Too many for a canine, arranged in rows that looked designed for shearing meat. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, found the creature in the sights, and it looked at the gun. Looked at it the way a person would look at a tool, with recognition and understanding. Then it looked back at me, and its lips pulled back from those teeth in what could have been a snarl, or could have been something worse. Something like a smile. "Get out," I said, and my voice was shaking so hard I barely recognized it. "Get out or I'll shoot." The creature tilted its head, that dog-like gesture of curiosity, and the chain creaked as it put more pressure on the door. "Sebastian," Mama said from the living room, her voice cutting through my panic. "Cold iron, the poker by the fireplace." The creature's ears swiveled toward her voice, and I saw something flicker across its face. Recognition, maybe, or memory. Then it looked back at me and made that sound again, that almost speech, and I realized it was trying to communicate something, trying to tell me something I had no way to understand. I kept the rifle trained on it and backed slowly toward the fireplace. The iron poker was where it always was, standing in the tool set beside the hearth, and I grabbed it with my free hand. The metal was cold and heavy, and the moment my fingers closed around it, the creature at the door went absolutely still. It stared at the poker. Just stared. Ears flat against its skull now. Lips dropping to cover the teeth. And then it let go of the door and backed away out of the light. That low, rumbling sound vibrating through the air like distant thunder. The door swung shut from the chain's tension, and I stood there in Mama's kitchen, holding an iron poker in one hand and my father's rifle in the other, listening to the sound of something massive moving around the outside of the house with footsteps that should have been heavy but were somehow silent. "It's testing us," Mama said, "finding out what works, what doesn't. It knows about the iron now. It won't come at that door again." "Then what will it do?" She didn't have an answer to that. And we spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with every light in the house blazing, listening to the creature circle and probe and test. It never tried the doors again, but twice more the motion sensors caught it at the windows, standing on its hind legs with its face pressed close to the glass, breath fogging the panes as it looked in at us like we were animals in a zoo exhibit. When dawn finally came, when the gray light started bleeding into the hollow and the darkness retreated back to the tree line, the creature was gone, but there were marks on every door and window frame, long scratches in the wood where those claws had tested the strength, mapped the construction, learned the layout of our defenses. And on the kitchen door, pressed into the wood beside the broken lock hole, was a handprint. A perfect print of that terrible hand with its two long fingers, its leathery palm, its thumb that looked almost human. The thing had left its mark there deliberately. I was certain of it. A message, a warning, a promise that it would be back. I took pictures of everything, filled my phone's memory with images of scratches and tracks in that handprint. Then I loaded Mama and Duke into my truck and drove down the hollow road toward civilization, toward people and traffic and safety, while behind us, something stood at the tree line and watched us go. I drove Mama to Ray's place in Clarksburg. 47 miles of white-knuckled steering while Duke whined in the back seat, and Mama stared out the window without speaking. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to pull over twice. Once, to vomit in a gas station bathroom, and once just to sit on the shoulder, with my forehead pressed against the steering wheel, trying to remember how to breathe. The sun was fully up by the time we reached Ray's subdivision. Those neat rows of vinyl-sided houses with their landscaped yards and mailboxes shaped like barns, and the normalcy of it all felt like a hallucination after what we'd left behind in the hollow. Ray came out when we pulled up, coffee mug in hand, wearing sweatpants and a mountaineer's hoodie, and I could see the concern on his face when he got a look at us. Mama looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight, and I probably looked worse. There were scratches on my forearms from where I'd torn through brambles in my panic to get pictures of the creature's tracks, and my shirt was stiff with dried sweat despite the October cold. "What happened?" Ray asked, and I opened my mouth to tell him the truth, to pour out everything I'd seen and heard and smelled. But Mama caught my eye and gave a tiny shake of her head. "Break-in," I said instead, and the lie tasted like copper on my tongue. "Had some trouble at the house. Thought it was safer to bring Mama here for a bit." Ray's eyes narrowed, moving from my face to Mama's, to the truck bed, where I'd thrown everything we could grab in 5 minutes of frantic packing. "You call the sheriff?" "They sent someone out." I lied again. Said it was probably kids, meth heads looking for money. Tore up the kitchen door pretty bad. Ray looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but Mama was already climbing down from the truck, moving stiff and careful like her bones hurt. And he went to help her. I stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, watching them walk toward the house. Duke whined again, a low, anxious sound, and I reached back to scratch his ears. The dog was trembling, had been trembling since we loaded him up. And I knew what he knew. That distance didn't mean safety. That whatever we'd left behind in the hollow wasn't bound by something as simple as geography. I spent the day at Ray's, drinking coffee I couldn't taste and pretending to watch college football while my mind replayed the night in an endless loop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hands, those almost human appendages with their black claws, testing the door frame like a carpenter examining his work. I kept checking my phone, scrolling through the pictures I'd taken, zooming in on the handprint until the pixels dissolved into meaningless squares of color. "You want to tell me what really happened?" Ray asked during halftime, keeping his voice low so Mama wouldn't hear from the guest room where she'd finally agreed to lie down. "I already told you. Sebastian." He set his beer down with enough force to slosh foam over the rim. "I've known you since you were 6 years old. I was there when your dad died. I know what you look like when you're scared, and brother, you're scared shitless right now." I wanted to tell him. God, I wanted to tell someone who might believe me, who might help me make sense of what I'd seen. But the words wouldn't come. And even if they did, what would I say? That a werewolf had tried to break into Mama's house? That something out of a fairy tale or a horror movie was stalking the hollow where our family had lived for 5 generations? Ray would think I'd lost my mind. And maybe I had. "Just drop it," I said finally, and something in my voice must have convinced him, because he nodded and turned back to the television, and we spent the rest of the game in silence, broken only by the announcers' voices and the occasional sound of Mama coughing in the other room. I stayed at Ray's that night, sleeping on the couch, with my father's rifle propped against the coffee table, and Duke pressed against my legs. Every sound woke me, the furnace kicking on, branches scraping the siding, the neighbor's cat yowling in the dark. I'd jerk awake with my hand reaching for the gun, heart hammering, certain that I'd heard that low rumbling growl outside the window. but it was always nothing, just the ordinary sounds of suburban night. And eventually I'd drift back into shallow dreams, filled with amber eyes and too many teeth. The next morning I drove back to the hollow alone, leaving Mama at Ray's where she'd be safe. I told myself I was going back to secure the house properly, to board up the windows and maybe collect some more of her things. But the truth was I needed to see it again, needed to confirm in daylight that what I'd experienced in darkness was real and not some collective hallucination born of isolation and old family stories. The hollow looked different in full sun, less threatening somehow. The trees just trees and the shadows just shadows. I parked in Mama's driveway and sat there for 10 minutes with the engine running, working up the courage to get out. Duke had refused to come with me, had hidden under Ray's porch when I tried to load him into the truck, and I couldn't blame him. Whatever instinct animals had that let them sense danger was screaming at that dog to stay far away from this place. The kitchen door hung open, the security chain dangling broken from its moorings, and I could see the claw marks in the wood from where I sat. I grabbed the rifle and my phone and walked slowly up to the porch, watching the tree line, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The morning was full of normal noise, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant sound of someone's chainsaw echoing down the valley. The wrongness from before had lifted, or maybe just retreated, waiting. Inside, the house looked like a tornado had torn through it. The kitchen table was on its side, chairs scattered, and there were muddy tracks across the linoleum floor, tracks that showed the digitigrade foot structure clearly, the weight distribution all wrong for any animal I knew. The scratches on the door were deeper than I'd realized, grooves carved into the solid oak, like someone had gone at it with a wood chisel. And the handprint was still there, pressed into the wood beside the ruined lock, each finger pad distinct, the palm wide and leathery. I took more pictures, documented everything with the methodical attention I usually reserved for construction site safety reports. Part of me was thinking about proof, about evidence that might convince someone this wasn't a delusion. But a larger part knew that no amount of pictures would matter, that people see what they were prepared to see and anything else gets filed away as hoax or mistake or madness. The living room was worse. The poker I'd grabbed the night before lay on the floor near the fireplace, and there were scorch marks on the rug where it had been. Black marks, like the iron had been white hot, though I knew it had been cold when I touched it. The windows showed scratch marks on the outside of the glass, and one pane had a crack running through it, starred out from a central impact point where something had struck it hard. I was photographing the window damage when I heard it, that low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere behind the house. I froze, rifle coming up automatically, every nerve suddenly alive and screaming. The sound came again, closer this time, and I backed toward the front door, trying to watch all directions at once, trying to remember if I'd locked the truck or left the keys in the ignition. Then I saw it through the back window, and this time there was no darkness to hide in, no shadows to soften the horror of what I was seeing. It stood at the edge of Mama's garden, maybe 30 feet away, and the full daylight revealed every impossible detail of its construction. It was massive, 7 feet tall, easy, maybe more when you accounted for the way it hunched forward with its shoulders rolled inward. The body was wrong in ways my brain kept trying to correct, to force into a shape that made sense. broad through the chest, like a man but narrower at the hips. The legs bent backward at the knee joint, the feet elongated and digitigrade like a dog running on its toes. The arms hung too long, the hands almost dragging, and those hands were the worst part, the detail my mind kept catching on and then sliding away from, in revulsion. They were almost human. That was the horror of it. Not quite right, stretched and elongated and tipped with black claws, but recognizably similar to human hands in their structure, in the way the thumb opposed the fingers, in the delicate articulation of each joint. You could imagine those hands holding tools, manipulating objects, doing all the things that hands were meant to do, and the wrongness of that thought made my stomach heave. The head was pure wolf, or what a wolf's head might look like if you scaled it up and mounted it on a creature that stood upright. The snout was long and powerful, the jaw heavy with muscle, and when it opened its mouth to make that rumbling sound again, I could see the teeth. Too many teeth, arranged in rows that overlapped, some pointing forward and some angled back like a shark's, designed to grip and tear and hold. The eyes were amber, pale gold in the sunlight, and they watched me with an intelligence that was somehow worse than simple animal hunger. The fur was gray-black, thick and matted, with bald patches showing the skin underneath. Dark, leathery skin, stretched tight over jutting ribs. It looked starved, like something that had been wandering and hunting for a long time without enough to eat. And I understood suddenly that this wasn't a supernatural manifestation or a demon or any kind of spirit. This was an animal, a living thing made of flesh and blood and hunger. And that made it more terrifying somehow, because animals didn't follow the rules we wanted them to follow, didn't respect boundaries or listen to reason. We stared at each other through the window glass, and I raised the rifle slowly, finding it in the sights, my finger moving to the trigger. The creature tracked the movement, watching the gun with those two intelligent eyes, and I saw its muscles bunch, saw it preparing to move. I fired through the window, the glass exploding outward in a shower of fragments, and the rifle's kick slammed back into my shoulder hard enough to bruise. The creature jerked, stumbled sideways, and I worked the bolt and fired again and again, emptying the magazine into that massive target. At least 2 rounds hit center mass. I saw the fur jump, saw dark blood spray across the dead garden plants. But the creature didn't drop, didn't fall, just kept moving with that awful fluid grace. It came at the house in a rush, covering the 30 feet in maybe 2 seconds, and I was running toward the front door, screaming something wordless, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the empty rifle. I heard the creature hit the back of the house, heard boards splintering and glass shattering, and then I was outside, stumbling down the porch steps, running for my truck. I got the door open, threw the rifle across to the passenger seat, and my hands were on the keys when I realized I could hear it inside the house, moving fast, knocking over furniture. And it was going to come out that front door any second, and I wouldn't get the engine started in time, wouldn't get the truck in gear, wouldn't make it out of the driveway before it caught me. The iron poker. Mama's voice in my head, clear as anything. Cold iron. The old ways still work on old things. I grabbed the rifle and ran back into the house like a man possessed, like someone operating on instinct and adrenaline with no conscious thought involved. The creature was in the kitchen. I could hear it, could smell that thick musk. and I went straight to the fireplace in the living room and grabbed the poker where it lay on the scorched rug. The metal was ice cold, despite sitting in the morning sun, cold enough to burn my palm, and I turned toward the kitchen just as the creature came through the doorway. It moved on all fours now, loping like a wolf, but with those two long arms giving it a strange rolling gait, and its eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like physical contact. I screamed something, maybe a threat, maybe a prayer, and when it lunged, I drove the poker up and forward with all my strength, putting my weight behind it the way my father had taught me to drive fence posts. The pointed end took the creature in the hollow of its throat, and I felt resistance, felt the metal punch through skin and muscle and the cartilage rings of its windpipe. The creature made a sound I'll hear until the day I die, something between a howl and a human scream, a sound of pain and rage, and something else I couldn't identify. It thrashed, one massive hand closing on my shoulder hard enough to lift me off my feet, claws punching through my shirt and into the meat of my back. I held onto the poker with both hands and twisted, and the creature screamed again and released me, stumbling backward. I hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind out of me, rolled, came up with my back against the wall, and watched the creature stumble toward the door. The poker stood out from its throat like a flagpole, blood running black down the iron shaft, and the creature pawed at it with its massive hands, trying to pull it free but flinching back every time its skin made contact with the metal. It backed through the kitchen door, still making that awful sound, and I heard it crash through the garden, heard the underbrush breaking as it fled toward the tree line. The sounds faded gradually into the distance, deeper into the hollow, following the creek bed up toward the high ridges where no one lived anymore, where the old homesteads had fallen to ruin and been reclaimed by the forest. I sat on Mama's living room floor for a long time, bleeding from the scratches on my back, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. Eventually I got up and found her medical kit under the bathroom sink, twisted myself around in front of the mirror, and cleaned the wounds as best I could with peroxide that burned like liquid fire. The scratches were shallow, more like bad scrapes than real cuts, but they'd bleed for hours and the scars would be permanent. 4 parallel lines across my left shoulder blade, a reminder I didn't need and couldn't escape. I walked out to the garden where the creature had stood and found blood on the dead tomato plants. Dark blood, nearly black, that dried sticky on my fingers when I touched it. I found the rifle casings from my shots, found the gouges in the siding where the creature's claws had torn through when it rushed the house. And I found tracks leading away into the forest, tracks that showed it was moving on 3 limbs now, favoring its left side, where at least one of my bullets had connected. I took pictures of everything, then got in my truck and drove back to Clarksburg. So I thought about stopping at the sheriff's office, about walking in and making a report, about showing them the scratches on my back and the pictures on my phone and demanding they do something. But what would I tell them? That a werewolf had attacked my grandmother's house? That I'd shot it 5 times and stabbed it with an iron poker and it had still managed to escape? They'd think I was having a breakdown or on drugs or looking for attention. They'd nod sympathetically and file a report that went nowhere and mark me down as another person who couldn't handle life in the isolated hollows, another casualty of rural poverty and meth and desperation. So I didn't stop. I drove straight to Ray's and told him the house wasn't safe, that the damage was worse than I'd thought, that Mama couldn't stay there anymore. He looked at the blood soaking through my shirt and started to ask questions, but I just shook my head and he let it drop. Some things you know not to push. I spent the next month moving Mama out of the hollow. I found her a senior apartment in Wheeling, a nice place with an elevator and security doors and neighbors on all sides. The kind of place where nothing could approach without being seen by a dozen witnesses. She didn't argue, didn't ask why the sudden urgency, just packed up the belongings that mattered and left behind everything else without looking back. We didn't talk about that night, didn't mention the creature or the scratches or the iron poker I'd left embedded in its throat. There was an understanding between us that some things were better left unspoken, that talking about it would make it more real somehow, would give it power over us that silence could keep at bay. I put the hollow property up for sale through a real estate agent in Clarksburg, priced it low enough to attract a quick buyer. A Pittsburgh developer bought it for cash 3 weeks later, planning to tear down the old house and put in a vacation cabin. I didn't warn him about what lived in those woods. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that the creature was probably dead by now anyway from its wounds. But the truth was I just wanted to be done with it, wanted to take the money and sever every connection I had to that place. I quit my construction job in Wheeling because the roots took me too close to Lost Creek, because I'd find myself staring at the turnoff to the hollow road and feeling my hands start to shake on the steering wheel. I told my boss it was time for a change, that I wanted to try something new, and he wrote me a good recommendation that helped me land a site manager position in Columbus, Ohio. 200 miles of highway between me and that valley, and it still didn't feel like enough. Ray stopped calling after a few months. I could tell he thought I'd had some kind of breakdown, that the isolation and grief over my father had finally caught up to me, and maybe he was right in a way. I'd changed. Anyone could see that. Jumped at loud noises, couldn't stand to be in the dark, kept iron nails hammered above every door and window in my apartment. When my girlfriend Emily asked about them, asked why I'd mounted horseshoes in every room like some kind of paranoid survivalist, I couldn't explain, and she left 3 weeks later. I couldn't blame her. I'd become someone different, someone haunted, and that person wasn't good company for anyone. Mama and I talked every Sunday, careful conversations about her new apartment and my new job and the weather, never about the hollow or what we'd left behind there. But sometimes late at night when the Ohio wind rattled my 4th floor windows, she'd call just to make sure I was okay, just to hear my voice. And I knew she was thinking about it too, about that thing with its amber eyes and too many teeth. Duke died about 2 years after we left the hollow. Mama said it was old age, that he'd just laid down on the kitchen rug in her apartment and didn't get up. But I knew better. I'd seen the way that dog had looked at the tree line, the way he'd known something was wrong long before I did. Animals understand things we don't, and whatever Duke understood had broken something in him that night, had left him waiting for the thing in the darkness to finally come and finish what it started. I follow the news from West Virginia obsessively now, scrolling through local papers online every morning with my coffee, looking for any mention of livestock deaths or missing hikers or unexplained attacks in Braxton County. There are always some. This is rural West Virginia, after all, where people disappear into the hills for any number of mundane reasons. But sometimes I'll read about a deer found torn apart, or cattle killed but not eaten, or someone's dog that ran into the woods and never came back, and I'll feel that cold certainty settle in my gut. It's still there, still hunting, still moving through those hollows like it owns them. I'm 36 now, 4 years gone from that October night, and I've built a life that's safe, if not exactly happy. The apartment in Columbus is small but secure, 4th floor with no balconies, steel doors with dead bolts and those iron horseshoes above every frame. I work my site manager job and come home and heat up frozen dinners and watch television until I'm tired enough to sleep. I don't date anymore. Don't let anyone close enough to ask about the scars on my back or the way I can't relax after dark or why I keep a loaded gun within reach at all times. The gun is a custom piece now, not my father's old hunting rifle, but something I'd made by a gunsmith in Cleveland who didn't ask questions when I brought him iron pellets and asked if he could load shotgun shells with them. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly and named his price, and I walked out a week later with 2 boxes of shells that probably wouldn't work on any normal target, but might, just might, work on something that wasn't normal at all. I haven't been back to West Virginia since I moved Mama out. I make excuses at every family gathering, send gifts instead of showing up in person, ignore Ray's occasional messages asking if I'm ever going to visit. The thought of driving those mountain roads, of being surrounded by forest and darkness and all that empty space where anything could be watching, makes my chest tight and my hands shake. I know what people think, that I've abandoned my family, that I've gotten too big for my raising, that the city changed me, and I let them think it because it's easier than the truth. The truth is I'm scared. 4 years and 200 miles of distance, and I'm still scared in a way that's become part of my baseline existence. The way some people live with chronic pain or tinnitus or any other condition that never quite goes away. I sleep with lights on and I check locks obsessively, and I can't go into real woods anymore, can't even walk through the parks in Columbus without feeling my heart rate spike and my senses go hyper alert, scanning the trees for movement, for eyes, for any sign of something that shouldn't be there. Sometimes I dream about it, about that thing with its wolf head and its terrible hands. And in the dreams, it still has my iron poker protruding from its throat like a flag of surrender. But it's not surrendering, it's just waiting, just biding its time until I let my guard down or make a mistake or forget for one moment that some things don't die just because you shoot them and stab them and run away. In the dreams, it speaks to me in a voice that sounds almost human, tells me it's still there in the hollow, still hunting, still waiting for me to come back. And I wake up sweating and shaking and have to turn on every light in the apartment and check every lock before I can breathe normally again. Mama turned 82 last month. I sent her a gift card and called to wish her happy birthday, and we talked about the weather and her bridge club and my work, and neither of us mentioned that this was the first birthday since I was 6 that I hadn't been there in person. At the end of the call, just before we hung up, she said something that made my blood run cold. "Sebastian," she said, and her voice was soft, almost resigned. "If something ever happens to me, don't you come back here to bury me, you understand? Don't you set foot in that hollow again for any reason." Mama, promise me. I promised, because what else could I do? And after I hung up, I sat in my apartment with its 4 floors of concrete protection and its iron horseshoes and its loaded gun, and I knew that she was still seeing them, still watching those like amber eyes at the tree line, still living with the knowledge that the thing we'd escaped from was patient in a way that nothing human could match. It's still out there. I know this the way you know a storm is coming, the way animals know when earthquakes are imminent. Some deep instinct that bypasses rational thought and connects directly to the fear centers of the brain. It's out there in the West Virginia hills, in the hollows that are emptying of people and returning to wilderness, in the forests that grow darker and deeper every year as the families move away, and the houses collapse, and the roads grow over. Maybe it's the last of its kind. Some remnant population clinging to existence in the isolated pockets of genuine wilderness that still exist in these mountains. Maybe there are more of them, a whole population that our ancestors knew and feared and tried to warn us about with their stories of werewolves and wendigos and things that walked like men but weren't men at all. I don't know. And the not knowing is its own special kind of torment. What I do know is that 4 years of distance and concrete and locks haven't made me safe. Not really. Because the thing about predators is they remember and they're patient and they understand territory in a way that transcends human concepts of property and ownership. I left its territory, but that doesn't mean it's forgotten me. That doesn't mean it won't come looking someday, following some trail of scent or memory or instinct that will lead it across 200 miles and 4 floors to the door where I sleep with lights burning and a gun loaded with iron pellets. And on the nights when I can't sleep, when the fear is too present and the memories too vivid, I wonder if maybe it would be better to go back, to load up my truck with iron and silver and every weapon I could carry and end it one way or another, to stop running and turn and face the thing that took my home and my family and my peace of mind and turned me into this hollow, frightened version of myself. But I don't. I stay in Columbus in my 4th floor apartment and I work my site manager job, and I call Mama every Sunday, and I keep the lights on at night. I survive, which is all any of us can do when we've seen the things that live in the darkness and learned that the old stories were warnings, not fairy tales. I survive, and I wait, and I know that somewhere in the West Virginia hills, something is waiting too.